I just had the pleasure of meeting Ron in the hallway, and I didn't realize that we had a little kinship. I realized Ron was a retired Army officer, so thank you for your service, and I'm very glad to have you here with us, Ron. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Ron Ross, who is a fellow at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, as we all know it. His current areas of specialization include information security and risk management. Dr. Ross leads the Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA, implementation project, which includes the development of security standards and guidelines for the federal government, contractors, and the United States critical information infrastructure. Dr. Ross is the principal architect of the risk management framework and multi-tiered approach that provides a disciplined and structured methodology for integrating the suite of FISMA standards and guidelines into the comprehensive enterprise-wide information security program. In addition to his responsibilities at NIST, Dr. Ross supports the United States State Department in an international outreach program for information security and critical infrastructure protection. Dr. Ross previously served as the Director of National Information Assurance Partnership, a joint activity of NIST and the National Security Agency. Dr. Ross is a 3-time recipient of the Federal 100 Award for his leadership and technical contributions to critical information security projects affecting the federal government, and is a recipient of the Department of Commerce Gold and Silver Medal Awards. Mr. Ross holds a PhD and a master's degree from the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School in computer science with specialization in artificial intelligence and robotics. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Ross.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back in the great state of California. I started my military career. I was appointed to West Point back in the late 60s. And I was just recurring. When I left, I think Governor Brown was governor then, and I come back and he's still governor. I think he left, didn't he, sometime in between? Well, thank you again for inviting me here today. We have a lot to cover in about an hour. I want to bring you up to date. There's so many important things going on in the federal government today that affect all the states and local governments with regard to cybersecurity. So I'm going to just jump into the slide deck. Can we get the first, there we go. You know, most of you are experiencing the exact same thing that we are at the federal government. You have lots of great information technology. I mean, we are so blessed to have the greatest technology in the world today. And with that technology comes a lot of responsibility, because every one of our core missions and business operations today depends on that technology being dependable. And of course, today we're living in a world of very sophisticated threats. These cyber attacks are happening routinely, and the most common question I get asked every day is, how come after 10 years of having all this great legislation under FISMA, the Federal Information Security Management Act, and all the standards and guidelines, and everything we're doing at the federal level, the state level, how come we still have cyber attacks that are, impacting our systems? And the answer is on this slide. Explosive growth of information technology, we're using it. It's a commodity now. 40 years ago, when I first started, it was the mainframe computer. It consumed vast amounts of an organization's resources to get that mainframe up and running and maintain it. Somewhere along the line, the technology became a commodity, very cheap, very powerful, and we bought more and more of it. And as we bought more of it, it got more complicated. The average operating system today has 30 or 40 million lines of code. And with that complexity, there's a lot of stuff that can happen with regard to cybersecurity. So we also, at the same time, started to connect everything together. We have these powerful global networks, local area networks. Every kind of device is connected to everything else. Smartphones, tablets, laptops, going back right to the corporate networks. So you couple the explosion of technology with the connectivity, and then you add that third bullet. This is a new generation of malware coming out. Unprecedented numbers of malware and sophistication. Exponential curve in the number of types of cyber attacks and malware that we're seeing. The average antivirus product a few years ago would stop almost everything coming through the network. It was pretty good, the signatures they had. Today, if you talk to the big companies, they will tell you that that number is under 50%, which means about half of the malware coming through your network is not going to be caught necessarily by those antivirus products. So that means we have to do a lot more because we have a lot at stake here. And I want to start out by talking a little bit about the need for broad-based solutions. Cybersecurity today is unlike anything we've ever experienced before. It brings together both national security concerns and the non-national security or economic security concerns. And when we talk about the critical infrastructure, which includes things like the 8 areas on the slide, the energy sector, transportation, finance, we're all using the same technology. And every one of these sectors is enduring what I would call a blistering set of cyber attacks that really have the potential to degrade or debilitate or even bring down the core capabilities of some of these sectors in the critical infrastructure. So it's the solutions we have to put on the table today. And this is why NIST works so hard to put out publications that you can use on a voluntary basis if you're not required to use them under FISMA. It's because all of us have a stake in the outcome here. And if you talk about, we're going to talk about the advanced persistent threat here, this is what really concerns us today. The advanced persistent threat is using multiple types of techniques. They use a combination of cyber, physical, and deception. And the primary intent is to get a foothold in your organization, not for the quick win. They want a long-term presence there, and they usually want to do one of two things. Either they want to bring down your capability, for example, the air traffic control system, critical capability at the federal level. That's a big target today. If you lose the FAA's air traffic control system, pilots fly blind. People's lives are at risk. That's one potential. And with the type of malware today, you may not know that malware is already inside your system, and they may not want to bring you down tomorrow. They may want to wait a week or two. But they can bring the capability down at the time of their choosing, not yours. And that's an important point to consider. The second thing, which I think is actually more important at this point in time, has to do with something we call exfiltration. That's stealing stuff from you. The same malware implanted right in that system, maybe coming from that web browsing session you did last lunch hour, or the email attachment that you opened, that malware now is in place. And the director of the National Security Agency said a few months ago, exfiltration is probably the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of mankind from us to the other side. Things like next generation automobile design from General Motors, or a healthcare company working on some new innovative technology, or a software developer from the Silicon Valley. You see, you can't have this massive exfiltration, especially in a world where we're struggling economically. We're trying to get through these times, and some of the companies, our great companies, are working on very close margins. And when you have to deal with the exfiltration problem on top of that, competing in the global marketplace, it's a very big issue for all of us as far as the future of the country and the future of the economy. So the APT, we're going to talk about that a little later. There are things you can do, even today within your systems, to make sure that your missions and your core business operations are going to be as secure as you can make them. These are unconventional threats that I always talk about because most folks today, when they think about threats, they're thinking about hurricanes, earthquakes, fires, cyber attacks. But actually, these are unconventional threats that can have just as much effect on a good security program as those other types of threats that you might go to the Department of Homeland Security or wherever you get your threat data. First one is complexity. And I wanted to relate this to the panel that was just up before I came on. We're all concerned about cost today. Cybersecurity is an investment in your mission success, but there's also a cost associated with it. And the biggest challenge for every one of us on the security side is to make the argument to our senior leaders why they should spend more money on this stuff we call cybersecurity. So in some sense, you have to make the argument that if you don't invest in cybersecurity, you are putting your core missions and business operations in jeopardy. The data is very clear out there. We've been collecting threat data for the last decade or so. We have the best threat data on the planet. We know where these attacks are coming from. We can tell how the attacks are put together. We can see who's being targeted, and we can see what kind of success they're having. And the picture is not that bright right now, but we have a lot of help on the way, and I'm going to talk about some of those things today. The first thing you can do is address complexity. And this kind of gets into the notion of how much things cost today. IT is not cheap because even though the unit cost may be low, we have a lot of it. And there's a maintenance tail with that IT that every organization has to deal with. So one of the things we can do right off the bat is reduce the complexity of the information technology infrastructure. We have a lot of technology. We have a lot of IT. We can probably do with less. And cloud computing, for example, is one way where you can actually reduce that digital footprint by not owning everything. The cloud model is on-demand services. You have the infrastructure as a service, you have platform, you have software. There are public clouds, there are private clouds. There's so many different models you can choose from in accordance with your risk tolerance. And again, sometimes going to that public cloud is not going to be the answer. There's more risks sometimes that you don't know where your data is stored necessarily, but those are things that we can get a handle on. The important point is reducing complexity, because all of you know who are in the IT security part of this business that you have to understand how things are put together in order for you to be able to protect them. And if things get too complicated, you really can't deploy the right security controls at the right place at the right time to make a difference. So reducing complexity is job number one. Connectivity. Everything doesn't have to be connected just because it can be connected. And this is going to be a challenge moving forward. You know just as well as I do that we have all these very powerful mobile devices, the smartphones, the tablets. And make no mistake about it, those devices have powerful computer systems embedded within those small devices. Lots of bandwidth, lots of computing power, lots of secondary storage. And it's making us more efficient. It's changing the way we do business in so many ways. That's why it's a hard sell to tell people, hey, use the technology wisely. Just because you can hook up that smartphone or that tablet to your corporate network, if you're going to do that, you have to manage the risk. And what does that mean? Not just accepting the risk, it means understanding what that risk really is today. Many of these small devices don't have the security controls on those devices that we have on our average laptops or any other types of the larger systems that we're used to. And it's not to say those controls can't be implanted on those systems or integrated into those devices, but we just haven't done that very well yet. We're starting to do that a little bit more. So the thing about connectivity is very simple. Make sure that if you have to have connectivity, that you're protected on both sides. Protect your side, and then those mobile devices that go out with the workforce, make sure they have the adequate protections on there that are just at the same level of your risk tolerance. There's no perfect security today. We can't cover everything, every vulnerability, because of the complexity. Too many weaknesses and deficiencies, lots of vulnerabilities, and we don't have time, energy, or the resources to cover them all. That's why risk management is so important today. That's the way we operate. And again, I heard the panel talking last hour about kind of integrating the security into the culture. And that's when you know your organization is really mature with regard to cybersecurity and risk management. Every program decision, every new acquisition, anything that involves the core missions and business operations of a company, if the security team has not been brought in and consulted to help understand what the risks are and what potential courses of action the senior leaders can take to reduce that risk to a tolerable level, then you're missing a big opportunity. And that's one of the big things today at the federal level. We're not doing a very good job of integrating those security professionals into our mainstream organizational processes. Things like acquisition or enterprise architecture or the system development lifecycle or the systems engineering process. This is where you can make a real difference when you integrate those requirements early in the life cycle. It's very difficult to add a lot of these things on after the system has been developed and deployed. The digital footprint I mentioned is getting larger and larger. Every time you buy a smartphone or you bring a new tablet into the organization, add a laptop, that's your digital footprint. And we routinely communicate across the networks today, and we're leaving our footprints every step of the way as we go. Whether you're working at home, doing home banking, or whether you're working in the office, the digital footprint is getting bigger because the technology is getting more expansive. These are some of the challenges that all of us face today, even with all of our great security publications and all the things we're doing up to this point. These are challenges that continue to give us problems. Certainly mobile computing, we have to figure a better way to deploy the right safeguards and countermeasures on those devices. We had a situation several years ago at the Veterans Administration. This could have actually happened to any organization, just happened to the VA. They were the unlucky one. But an employee took a laptop computer home with a hard drive, and the laptop was stolen either out of their car or out of their house. I can't recall which one. But it had 26.5 million veterans records on that hard drive, totally unprotected. So the VA, the first thing they did is they sent out 2 letters to every veteran, just the postage alone. You can imagine the dollar signs going off now. And then they decided they were going to give credit protection to every veteran. They never did that, but they were considering it. That would have been a huge cost. The message here is, with a very simple solution, full disk encryption, you can prevent all of that vulnerability. If I take my laptop or my smartphone and I leave it on the metro in DC, the only thing I've lost is the cost of the device itself. The information is what really has value today, and that's really an important message. We can replace the devices and the software programs and all of that, but the data, the information, especially if it's what we call critical or sensitive data, healthcare records, financial information. There's a whole range of data types today that really are bringing this problem right square in our labs. Very important things to consider. I mentioned cloud computing because when you're having that discussion with your senior leaders and you can offer them the opportunity to reduce their infrastructure cost by 5 to 40%, that's a discussion they may be willing to listen to. Reducing complexity is a powerful way to help security. Reduces your cost. It actually can provide better services because when you go through enterprise architecture or cloud computing, you're kind of doing things more efficiently. You're getting rid of unnecessary lines of business or things that are duplicative. You're getting rid of IT that doesn't need to be replicated. It's redundant. And all of that translates to a leaner and meaner IT infrastructure, which then will spawn better security. Now we understand more about everything connected to everything else, and we can do a better job at deploying those controls that we need to deploy. Identification authentication. We've been doing 2-factor now. We were supposed to start it back in 2006. We're just now finishing at the federal level a full deployment of the PIV cards, personal identity verification cards, and all of those 2-factor capabilities that go with that. 2-factor authentication is a very powerful capability. If you implement 2-factor, you take a whole class of cyber attacks off the table. And in today's world where we have so many things to worry about, it's good that there are technologies available that are fairly low cost that can actually take a whole bunch of these things off your plate. And that's really a good thing that we can kind of go to the bank with and really take advantage of. Trustworthiness of applications. How many folks today on their smartphones, literally my son has hundreds of applications on his smartphone. I carry a BlackBerry because it's issued by the government. I can't have any apps on my BlackBerry. The trustworthiness of applications is important. There's a concept in our business called the security stack. It starts at the application and goes down through the middleware, the operating system, the firmware, all the way down to the integrated circuits. And trustworthiness of all of those pieces is very important. Now, about 2 decades ago, we had a vision we were going to have trusted operating systems. That was a big program that never really panned out. The problem you have today is that there are so many apps being developed, we have really no idea the trustworthiness of those apps. And if you're putting those apps on a mobile device and hooking them up to your corporate network and giving that attack vector clean access, that could potentially be a big problem. So again, you're faced with some challenges. It's not to say we don't use technology, but we have to be wise consumers. We have to not just load every app, we have to be a little more discerning about where the app came from. Who developed it? Do we know anything about the trustworthiness of those applications? That's what the new world we're living in today that we have to be more cognizant of. Resiliency is critical. The estimate today is about maybe 1 out of 5, or maybe a little less than that, cyber attacks gets through our best defenses. Maybe 80 to 90% we can stop. But there's 10% or so that we don't stop. And the question is, what happens when you don't stop that cyber attack? What's the next step? If that advanced persistent threat ends up doing damage to your system, where's the backup plan? And this is why the concept that we're pushing now is system resiliency. We have a lot of new controls coming out this fall in our 800-53 document that's being updated that addresses the notion of resiliency. This is like not just having a backup, backing up your data. This is having plans for alternate operations, alternate processing sites, redundancy, alternate communications channels. Because we found out on 9/11 that a lot of our communications went right through the World Trade Centers. It was kind of a single point of failure. That's why so many cell systems went down on that day. So we have to do a better job at saying, hey, if some of these attacks are getting through, what's our plan? What's the continuity of operations plan? What's the continuity of government plan at the federal level? That's a big concern. Where are the backups? How are we going to do it? Are people trained to understand what their role is in these contingency operations? And have we exercised that plan? A lot of the times when you look at the FEMA and all the state versions of FEMA, they do a lot of exercises all the time because they want to anticipate the kinds of things that may happen, and they can be prepared then to react to those situations. It's a time-tested approach that really works well in cybersecurity. Privileges and functionality. Most of you are familiar with WikiLeaks. This was like the 800-pound gorilla of bad privilege management. We had a soldier who was a bad actor. They took away his weapon, but didn't take away his privileges. And so the rest is history. Least functionality and least privilege are two core concepts in cybersecurity. They were every bit as relevant today. They are every bit as relevant as they were 40 years ago. Least privilege. We give way too many privileges to way too many people. And the more privileges you give, especially admin privileges, the greater the probability those privileges will be abused and bad things are going to happen. Least functionality. Again, I talked about this notion of all the applications on the smartphones and the devices. Again, that's kind of a violation of one of the fundamentals, least functionality. Vendors like to deliver products with maximum functionality. That's how they sell their products. They want to have everything on there that you could ever hope to need or want on that device. In our business, we come at it from just the opposite. We have this thing called least functionality. Only the ports, protocols, services, and functions that you need to have to do the mission. So we have one end of the spectrum here and the other end over here. The question for risk managers is, where is that middle point? How many of those functions and services and things do you allow before it gets too complicated and you can't really understand what your defenses look like and how to protect your core missions and business operations? And again, I heard last hour, awareness and training. I'll admit that we don't do a very good job at this. We spend maybe a few hours a year on cybersecurity training. It is all about people, processes, and technologies. It's defense in depth. And the people part is something we can't ignore. Our people are our greatest resource, but they can also be our greatest source of vulnerability sometimes. People are busy. They're working hard. They get sloppy sometimes. We all do it. This is why education, training, and awareness is so critical. We have a new program at NIST called the NICE Initiative, the National Initiative for Cyber Education. I think it was the deputy director or the director of NSA that said once that education and awareness and training should be one of our top priorities, especially if people are part of this workforce equation that we're always going back to. They're a key part of our operations. And so, today we still see that 90% of our cyber attacks come in over web and email. And the primary sources of those, phishing attacks, opening up email attachments, clicking on those web links when you're surfing what you think is that safe website during your lunch hour. I have a whole lot of examples, one in particular, of a major federal agency that went down for a couple of days because one of their employees during lunch break was surfing the web, going out to Home Depot or Lowe's, wherever they were doing. They think it's a safe website, but that one click on that URL brought in there's a term we use at NIST it's called boatload. It means a lot of malware. One click, boatload of malware, and it shut down the entire headquarters operation for about 2 days. That's pretty scary stuff. You've seen the things that with industrial control systems. This is why when you ask what keeps people up at night, it's our industrial control systems that work in these power plants. I visited one in Becker, Minnesota a few years ago. Becker's a small town, a couple thousand people. Most of them work in the coal-fired power plant, huge plant. Powers the city of Chicago, or a good chunk of it. And these systems are vulnerable. They are built for real-time process control. They're not built for cyber security purposes. And you look at the vulnerability. I know on the East Coast, I was a California transplant, so it was always amazing when I came out there, I had my first snow day. They really panic back there on the East Coast, and if they lose power for an hour or two or a day or two, get a little bit jumpy. And just think about Hurricane Katrina, where they lose it for a month or 2 or 3. Just think about a massive cyber attack that takes down the generating capacity of a good chunk of our national electric grid. See, energy and finance are 2 of the critical infrastructure pieces that are vital to us for different reasons. The country runs on energy, can't do without it. If you lose power for a day or 2 or 3 or a week, hospitals start shutting down. Transportation, goods and services don't move. Society starts to crumble. And that's why this is an imperative. It is critical that we start tackling these problems before it's too late. Finance, we all lived through the 2008 financial crisis, and that demonstrated to every one of us, even the most trusted financial system in the world can get into trouble sometimes. And we can't take things for granted. And again, a cyber attack on our core financial sector could be very devastating. I could go on and on. There's 1,000 reasons to do what you're doing. And just remember one thing, the adversary gets more clever every day. They have figured out a way now to get below the operating system. Most of you understand this term called BIOS, the basic input-output system. That's the firmware that boots up the operating system. Well, we have a new control coming out in the fall, in November, that is called firmware integrity. It's a control that requires, if you want to bring that control into your security plan, to test the malware to see if any bits have been flipped or if that malware has been tampered with. You hear reports coming out of, I heard a report a week ago on the news, some of the laptops coming out of China are being delivered now with malware installed. It's kind of a feature. It's become a feature on these laptops. So this is where we are today. So when you see the number of controls growing in the catalog from 600 to 850, there's a reason for every one of those controls going in. And it's not that you have to deploy all of them, but you really have to be a good consumer and figure out which ones of those controls in the NIST catalog or whatever other control set you might use, which of those controls are really needed to protect the information technology that is driving my core missions and business operations. I had a gal call me a few years back. This is a really good story because it illustrates an important concept that she said, I've got a real small business. I have a couple of servers, and it's going to cost me, my servers cost about $10,000, all my hardware and software, about $10,000. And she said, I looked at your control catalog, and if I'm going to do all that stuff that you recommend, it's going to cost me $50,000 to protect $10,000 worth of hardware and software. She said, why should I do that? That didn't sound like a very smart investment to me. And I said, well, what is your business case, if I might ask? And she said, well, I do internet-based business, and I have about $1 million a week we do in a revenue. I said, that's a lot of business in a week. I said, do you realize on Sunday night, if there's a cyber attack, malware goes into your servers, and you're down until Wednesday morning, until you can get all that stuff back up again, you have lost about $400,000 in lost business because you were down for 2 days. And I said, that's the good news. The bad news is your customers who came to your site and couldn't get in, they may go to your competitor. You may have lost your customer forever. I said, that's why you spend $50,000 to protect $10,000 in hardware and software. It's about the data. It's about the information, the reputation, and about the lost business revenue of being down in a world today that depends on information technology. So there's a lot of great stories that illustrate this. I want to use this next couple of slides to show you how we're doing business today and why it's not working very well. Most of you, like most of us on the federal government side, Every Tuesday, what do? We go out and we check for the latest patches that are coming out of all the companies, right? I call this the unconstrained search and hunt for vulnerabilities. Now, the problem with this is that we don't ever think about, if you look at it in the engine context, we got the hood up and we're taking the engine apart and looking at every piece. What we really ought to be doing is looking at the kind of car we want. And I'm using this analogy of the information system. We have to do a better job at understanding what kind of a system do we need that's strong enough, resilient enough to continue to support our core missions and our business operations. This micromanaging under the hood of waiting every Tuesday for the next group of patches to come out, that's an endless supply of patches coming out because we have an endless supply of vulnerabilities. And any first-year computer scientist can tell you that the number of weaknesses and deficiencies in the average software product that's developed, there's hundreds and thousands in there, and when those can be exploited, we call those vulnerabilities. Not all those can be exploited, but the ones that can are vulnerabilities, and there is virtually an endless supply. That's why the adversary always has the advantage. These zero-day attacks don't happen by accident. Zero-day attacks happen because someone on the other side, the bad guys, are looking at your stuff and they're saying, hey, I just found a flaw in that software that nobody else knows about but me, I think. And we'll test that theory when they send it out and they try to exploit. But this is why the strategy of building a car, we have to kind of flip this whole model around. We've got to figure out what kind of system we need first and then do what it takes to make sure those protections are built in early in that life cycle process. So what does the future look like? And again, I realize most of you have legacy systems out there like we do. And all this stuff's not going to change overnight, but we have a vision of how to get healthy for the future. And that's what I'm putting before you today to consider. In the future, we have to, before we actually build these systems, we have to consider what are the core missions and business operations of our organization, and what kind of mission and business processes are we creating to carry out those missions and business functions. And then this whole process definition then spawns what we call enterprise architecture. At the federal level, we call it the federal enterprise architecture. You may have one here at the state. There's lots of different architectures. But what architectures do, they take those mission and business processes and they make them real with regard to the technology that's going to be used to carry out those processes. In essence, you're going to be building a model that will result in information systems downstream. So one of the things we don't do very well is consider the threat. If you're building new systems today or you're building a new program and you don't go out and get a threat briefing, you're really not doing your due diligence. Whether you go to DHS or whether you have a security clearance, you can go to the NSA or the other three-letter agencies, understanding the threat, what they're capable of doing, is really important today. When you talk to the intelligence community, who we work very closely with now, they look at adversaries with regard to a couple of factors: capability, intent, and targeting. What's the adversary capable of? Do they have bad intentions toward me or my organization? And are they targeting me? Now, you can't always get perfect information, but if you're in a high-tech industry or you are at the Federal Aviation Administration or DHS, just by the fact of what you do, you become a target. And so this is something to understand: what are the types of threat sources that we're dealing with today, whether it's a hostile cyber attack or whether it's hurricanes, earthquakes, or just good old-fashioned software errors, human errors, or structural failures. All of those are threat sources that spawn threat events, tactics, techniques, and procedures that come out of those threat sources. And it's really important for the cybersecurity professionals to understand what the adversary is capable of so you can do a better job at articulating to your senior leaders what things they ought to worry about. And that'll help them make better risk-based decisions. It's all about risk management today. There is no such thing as perfect security. We can't avoid risk. I drive on the freeways out here. That's pretty risky business. We all agree about that. I still get out there and do it. I get into airplanes, a couple times a month, 3 times a month. It's about managing risk. And we have to know how to do that. And our senior leaders have a lot on their plate today, with the budgets they're trying to manage and the core missions. And we have to be the kind of folks that come in and say, hey, not the sky's falling every day, because that message kind of gets old after a while. That's why I said going in there and saying, hey, how'd you like to save about 30 to 40% on your IT costs? and maybe reinvesting half of that back into our cybersecurity, operations. That's the kind of message that folks can get their arms around. Talking about continuous monitoring, we're doing a lot of that now, but I would say to everybody here that continuous monitoring, the purpose of that is to understand the state of your systems on an ongoing basis, not just every couple of years or whenever you do your assessments. Because the threat space changes very quickly today, and so do your systems. So continuous monitoring is a way to understand on a kind of routine basis how you're doing today versus what you were doing yesterday. But I'll also add to that is that continuous monitoring on a weak, inherently weak IT infrastructure could be throwing good money after bad. So don't spend all your money on monitoring. You've got to invest in that stronger IT infrastructure over time. Even if you have legacy now, all of these systems at some point in time get upgraded. We get new systems occasionally. And at that point in time, you can really make a difference in getting these requirements integrated where they're supposed to be. This figure comes out of our Special Pub 800-39. This is the risk management process. Sometimes people confuse this with risk assessment. As you can see, risk management has 4 key components to it. Framing is what you do first. That's establishing the context of how your organization is going to manage risk. What are your assumptions? What are your constraints? What are your core missions in business operations? And here's one for you that I bet a lot of you don't consider. What's your risk tolerance? How many folks out here spend a lot of time with their senior leaders discussing risk tolerance? And what does that mean? Well, if we've got 850 controls coming out in the fall, you're not going to put all those controls in. When do you turn off the spigot of adding new controls? When is that time? Where's your bar set? See, knowing your risk tolerance that's the set point when you've done everything you can do and now you're going to go out in that real world and operate. And this is where your senior leaders have to be comfortable to say, we've done everything we can do and we are going to accept whatever residual risks we have. And that's a decision they make with their eyes wide open, not just having, someone give them some war stories. That's why everything in our publications, it's a disciplined and structured approach to getting to an answer. Not the right answer, because there is no right or wrong answer. Every one of your organizations is different, and they're going to come up with different solutions. But you can build those from the structures that we provided in the NIST guidelines. So once you frame and establish your context, now you go out and you assess risk. And what does that do? Well, you're looking at threats, vulnerabilities, impact to your mission, your core operations, and the likelihood that the threat could actually exploit that vulnerability to cause the impact. If every threat was 100% likely out there, then we would have to deploy every control. But as it turns out, some threats are more likely than others. If there's a 0 probability that that threat's going to do any damage, then you don't deploy anything. So this is what risk assessment is all about. It's really getting that kind of core gut feeling of where you stand in the organization today based upon what you know about the real world and what you're capable of doing to protect your critical assets. Now you get back that risk assessment results. And now what are you going to do about it? Well, this gets back to kind of what the military does. You put 3 or 4 courses of action in front of the commander and they have to make a choice. Same thing in our business. You've got to respond some way to those risks. You don't always fix stuff. Mitigation is one of 5 things you can do. You can also reject the risk out of hand. You can accept it. You can transfer risk sometimes with insurance. We can't do that at the federal level, but some companies do. Or you can share risk with other organizations. Those are 5 legitimate responses to risks that are going to be put before you. And then when you're done with all the courses of action, the organization selects their responses, you deploy, and then you're into the monitoring step. You're listening, you're waiting. You deployed a whole bunch of controls last month, and now you're going out and seeing, how good a job did I do? What kind of cyber attacks have been launched against my organization since I deployed those controls? And more importantly, which ones have actually gotten through and worked? What can I do to continuously improve those controls that I put in my security plan last month? That's what continuous monitoring and the risk monitoring is all about. Because when you sign a piece of paper today, accepting risk, I can guarantee you the risk that you accept today is not going to be the risk you're going to see tomorrow or the next week or next month. Why? Everything's changing. Your hardware, your firmware, your operating system, maybe a new service pack, You're patching things, bringing in new applications, adding different components, different devices. The threat space is sure changing. Sometimes your facilities change. Sometimes your people change. All of this is about change management and how does it affect your ability to protect yourself. That's really what the bottom line is. This also comes out of 800-39. And again, I want to go back to last hour's panel because they had it exactly right. Today, we operate at Tier 3. That's the information system level. That's going every Tuesday and looking at the patches and kind of, the computer scientists use a term called thrashing. That's what we're doing in many cases today. Tier 1 and Tier 2 in this risk management hierarchy say, look, we can't start managing risk at the tactical level. This is like having a company commander running around the battlefield without a battalion or without a brigade or a division surrounding it with that command and control and that vision for the grand battle plan. We have to go back up and organize ourselves for the fight at Tier 1, which means getting senior leaders involved in the governance process. Governance of cybersecurity and risk management means you have actual programs in place. And those programs are maturing over time, and every decision where you're deploying new technology is brought into that risk equation at that Tier 1, because out of that Tier 1, these are the top level folks, CEO, CFO, CIO, CISO, risk executive. They're producing a risk management strategy for the organization, not for one system or another system. This is for the organization. This is where you're answering those questions about how do we assess risk as a company in Silicon Valley versus a federal agency or a state agency? What kind of tools and techniques do we use? What's our risk tolerance? What are our assumptions? All that comes out of a strategy at Tier 1, and that strategy then is pushed out to Tier 2. Now, all the core missions that you prioritized at Tier 1 now are going into Tier 2, where you're actually building an enterprise architecture that reflects that risk management strategy. And most architectures today, unfortunately, don't have what we call the information security architecture embedded within that enterprise architecture. See, enterprise architecture does something very powerful for you. It consolidates, optimizes, and standardizes the infrastructure. Again, doing more with less can actually be beneficial, kind of counterintuitive. But that's what enterprise architecture, if you use it aggressively, can really do for you. And the architecture then allows you then to build that security architecture within that enterprise architecture. And what does that really mean? It means that your security team now works with all system owners. And we have a term called common controls. These are controls provided by the enterprise, like the building, the guards, guns, and gates, things that protect the IT on the inside are most of the time deployed by the enterprise on behalf of all system owners who are inside the building. So every system owner doesn't worry about every control. But this is a way to allocate controls across what in many organizations is a very complicated infrastructure of lots of systems supporting lots of missions and business operations. Where's the command and control for all those controls? What control is better served to be in this system versus that one? Why are these better to be common controls? And it gives you a much better perspective with limited resources on how to deploy and get the biggest bang for your buck with regard to security. Now that Tier 2, where you're using architecture, then provides a roadmap on how you're going to build all your systems in the future or how you're going to do your major upgrades. You know, if you bought a system and deployed it 3 or 4 years ago, totally different threat space at that time than we have today. Many of the same threats are still here, but we've added a whole bunch more. Remember the boatload? That's the boatload, number of malware that we're looking at today. So if you're going to go upgrade your system, you can use our publications to do a gap analysis. Were the threats that you were looking at 4 or 5 years ago, do we have new ones today that you should be concerned about? And what are you going to do about it? Are you going to upgrade a system? Are you going to put in additional controls? Are you just going to accept that risk and hope that nothing happens? Are you going to put in compensating controls? There's a lot of different choices that you can make. But the important part of all of this discussion is eyes wide open. Don't let your senior leaders, manage their risk with bad information. And it's not to say that we're always bringing the doomsday scenario. We've got to be able to speak the language of our senior leaders and our program managers who, what do they worry about? Cost, schedule, and performance. And then we come into town with our wheelbarrow full of security controls and requirements, and we expect them to do everything. Well, the answer is they can't do everything We've got to bring those requirements into the mix and then work with them to do trade-off analysis. Sometimes you don't deploy controls because they're too expensive. Maybe it's not really impacting on your mission. So there's a lot of decisions. You can work with these folks side by side, speaking the same language, and that really is a formula for a much better place than where we are today. This comes out of a special publication 837. It's the classic risk management framework, and it really is a very simple framework, 6 steps. And I'm not going to go through all the details, but this is what our folks use to figure out what controls do I really need at the system level. And of course, you see step number 1 is categorization of data. And this really ties to your cloud computing solutions as well, because categorization goes through and looks at all the different data types in your system: financial, procurement, personnel, personally identifiable information, whatever it might be. And it uses our FIPS publication 199 to attach a label to that data. We call it an impact label, either low, moderate, or high impact data. So high impact data is stuff that if you lose it or it's compromised, severe catastrophic effect on your operations. Low impact data doesn't matter very much. You could lose it, it can be compromised, it just doesn't affect you very much. Why is this important? Because when you go to select your controls in step number 2, you have to have an implicit understanding of the impact level of the data within the system that you're operating. As that data gets processed, stored, and transmitted, or sent across the network, you have to know how valuable it is. What's the criticality or sensitivity? Because if you don't know that, you can't pick the right controls to protect it. And so this all works kind of in a nice step-by-step framework. Cloud computing, it relates to cloud because maybe some of the lower impact data, this stuff's not that important. Maybe you can move that to the public cloud with a little bit less risk. Maybe some of your high impact data you want to keep back and build a private cloud, still taking advantage of that great reduction in the amount of IT and the complexity, but yet not sending your data to the public cloud where you may not know where it's stored or other things that may be of concern. There's a way to use the framework to really meet your specific business and government needs, whether it's state and local or federal or private sector. Once those controls are selected, they get implemented, and then we assess those controls to see if they're effective. We produce something called a security assessment report, which is an independent look at all the controls and where do things work well, where do things kind of not work so well. And that information then is passed back to the senior leadership who have to make a decision. Do we put this system into operation or continue its operation, or do we go back and add more controls, try to reduce our risk to a more manageable level? And then, of course, we go into that last step I talked about earlier, continuous monitoring. This is the buzzword from this slide. If you're doing EA, it's all about consolidation, standardization, optimization. And that translates, again, smaller means less complex in this case, and that's good news if you're a security person. You can't strengthen the underlying information technology infrastructure unless you do good architecture and use good engineering techniques. Now, you can't control very much what comes out of the commercial software industry. They're building products left and right, and you're buying those products and you're integrating those into your systems. But you can use good systems and security engineering techniques. There's a whole body of knowledge been developed. We're putting out a special publication in 2013 about engineering that really helps customers do a better job at taking all these diverse products, putting them together, and having some level of assurance about what you're ending up with. So architecture, engineering are very, very important concepts. These next three bullets, if you want to take away nothing more from today's discussion, simplify, specialize, and integrate. Those are the 3 buzzwords of the day, and they're very important for different reasons. The first one is when you're looking at that big catalog of controls and you're building your security plans, specialize those plans for your particular organization. You don't have to have all the controls that we have in the catalog. You can pick the ones that are specifically targeting the kinds of threats and the kind of business that you're actually conducting day to day. Simplification also, we talked about that with the enterprise architecture and all the things with it that reduce that complexity. And then the integration part, again, I mentioned that earlier. Most organizations, we operate our security practice in kind of a bubble. We're not integrated very well to the mainstream. At the federal level, we have all these CISO offices and all the security staff, part of the CISO. Sometimes they work for the CIO, sometimes they don't. But it's rare when you find organizations where those security professionals are actually integrated into the acquisition process. So when you're going out, either at the federal, state, or local, or even a private procurement, and you're going to go out and ask for something with regard to IT, it's a good idea to have your IT security folks there side by side with the acquisition team so they can make sure that the things you want to have delivered actually go into the specification, the procurement. We don't do that very well today. We talked about life cycle. Most of our security work ends up, unfortunately, being added on at the end, which is very hard to do. It's more expensive and it's less effective. 2 protection strategies. We're doing largely the first one today. It's called boundary protection. You recognize this. You're putting up the firewalls. You're doing the 2-factor authentication. You're putting in access controls. You're doing auditing. You're encrypting. You're building that castle wall as high as you can build it, and you're digging the moat as deep as you can. That's boundary protection. But what do we notice today about our boundaries? They're becoming more porous. Mobile computing, cloud. Those fortresses that we used to build are not the same anymore. So what do we have to do? Well, if a certain percentage of those cyber attacks are getting through, you have to adopt a strategy that's called Agile defense. You might call it by a different term, but what it really means is now, what do you do when that attack has actually penetrated your boundary and the adversary's on the inside and you're operating while you're under attack? The military deals with this all the time. The adversary attacks the enemy on the left flank, they counterattack, they do something different. This is the kind of agility we need to have in our organizations today. And what that translates to is being able to limit the damage that malware can do, or limit the time on target, as I like to say. The time on target is the time when the adversary actually breaches till they actually start executing their attack and either exfiltrating or bringing your capability down. So how do you architect your system so when the malware does come through, it gets compartmentalized? It can't move like wildfire throughout the entire corporate network. That's an architecture and engineering problem. And it's one that we can handle. We can do better. And when you do that, it's like I use the example of an oil tanker. You know, in the old days, they used to have the oil was in the hull of the tanker, all in one hull. And when that hull was punctured, the entire load got dropped. But they got smart and started to compartmentalize the load for these oil tankers. So if you get hit on the bow and you have one compartment that gets punctured, the whole load doesn't, disperse. So it's the same theory with our information systems. We've got to be able to do something where that one attack doesn't bring us down to ground zero and just everything goes out the door. Here are some things that Agile Defense looks at. Certainly when you have these large and complex systems, the first thing you can do is make them more manageable. You can decompose them into subsystems that are smaller and more manageable, and then on those individual subsystems or subcomponents, you can apply stronger controls to those particularly sensitive areas of the system that are processing that particularly sensitive data. Because you can't protect that entire large, complex system at the highest level. We don't have enough money, time, or expertise to do that. You can also do a lot with limiting privileges, virtualization. Cloud uses a lot of virtualization. If malware gets into a cloud, into a virtual machine, when that VM goes away, that malware goes away. That's pretty good news. That means these things can be refreshed periodically to get rid of some of that malware, unless the adversary has got into your hypervisor. And then you've got another problem. And now, you see, the adversary wants to get as low as they can in that stack. If they can get to the firmware, it's pretty much game over. So you can also limit privileges. You have control over what privileges people get. So don't give them out so easily. Be a little more stingy with those privileges, and it'll make a difference over time. When all else fails, you can go back to a known secure state. And that's easy to say, but it's hard to do. If a laptop gets a virus in it, you can go back to the image disk and all that. It takes a few hours sometimes, a little bit of work, but you know that you're going back to a known secure state. That is, unless the supply chain's been compromised. So that's another issue you have to worry about. But given you have a clean supply chain, that's always a good last resort. Well, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I wanted just to make a couple of comments on a publication that we're working very hard on to get you this fall. It's Rev 4 of the 853 document, updating all the security controls. And what's driving this publication, as you might expect, is the threat space. All those new different types of threats I talked about, we're trying to address each and every one of those to give you the best set of defensive mechanisms you can possibly have, whether it's management, operational, or technical in nature. You'll have the right things to do the right level of protection. We also discovered, since our third revision, we had a lot of gaps in the previous document. Insider threat, application security, the supply chain, and the list goes on. All of these areas now are being addressed in the new updated publication coming out in November. Don't forget about assurance. You know, the simple example I use is that if you flip the light switch up and down here in this room, that's functionality. That's equivalent to your access controls, your identification, authentication, and encryption. But what about when you go behind the wall and take a look how that light switch was built? What do the components look like? How are those components put together? Is that light switch going to operate under stress? Now, assurance isn't that important for, teenagers carrying around iPhones or whatever they're carrying today, the tablets. But if you've got a critical system, either at the federal, state, or local level, or maybe you're in the healthcare business and you have life support systems, and there's computers that are driving these things, or how many computers do you have in that new 2012 automobile you're driving around in today? 20, 30 computers? Those computers are controlling your braking system, all the other process controls that are going on there. You see, this is where assurance really becomes important. Because just like you can affect that generator with a cyber attack and bring that generator down to a smoking pile of rubble, now that we're all connected and computers are ubiquitous, all of this stuff makes a difference. Assurance is important. Making sure that the warfighter systems, these smart weapons, the targeting information isn't changed and those weapons are accurate. All of those things are about assurance. Having the card designs come out as they should. All of these things tie back to not just what the functions do, but how good is the software and the hardware that underlies all of that stuff. Important questions. We talked about monitoring. I'm gonna kind of skip over this one because we addressed most of those already. This is a great slide because it illustrates, again, what the panel talked about last hour. It's not always about technology. The right-hand side are all technology-based controls. You'll recognize a lot of them. Access control, biometrics, tokens, stuff that comes in the hardware, the software, and the firmware. But look at the left side. That's the management and operational side. A lot of folks don't think that stuff's very important. But it's like a chain. I use that chain because every link in that chain has to do its job in order for that chain to be effective. Any weak link makes the entire chain ineffective. So if you ignore your management operational side, adversaries are going to find your weakest link. If you don't train and educate your people, if you don't do that contingency plan, if you don't do a good risk assessment, all of that's kind of like on the softer side, people say, that stuff's critical. Because I would say that if there's one thing you ought to be worried about today and focusing on first is building your contingency plan. Because it's not a question of if your system is going to get penetrated, it's when. And it may already be penetrated and you don't even know. So that's why defense in depth is so important. People, processes, and technologies all working together in defense in depth. How's our time going? We're okay. So make sure we don't run too far. Okay, good. I'll take some Q&A. This is what the enterprise looks like in whatever we talked about today. This is the risk executive function at the top. That's where the strategy comes out. We have a couple of systems there that are using that risk management framework, the 6-step process that figures out what controls are being deployed in what part of the enterprise. You have common controls, and you have the strategic view versus the tactical. It kind of brings it all together under one umbrella. We're building this thing called the unified framework. We're working with the Defense Department and the intelligence community, all 16 intel agencies, to work on a common set of standards and guidelines, and they're on these next two slides. These are a handful of the total number of publications that NIST produces, but these are the ones that focus on risk management and cybersecurity that relates back to FISMA and some of the things we talked about today. The 39 document is the pyramid, 3 tiers, enterprise-wide view. The brand new risk assessment guideline just came out about 2 weeks ago. It's 800-30. You can download it free of charge. 37 document is the 6-step framework, and then we have our control catalog I mentioned coming out in November with that whole bunch of new controls that are tied to some of the threats, and then we have our assessment guideline as well. I mentioned we're building a new engineering guideline coming out in 2013, and again, I want to thank you all for being so patient today. You know, we work hard. Everything we do at NIST, you guys have already paid for that as taxpayers, and treat us like consultants. You know, we can come out to your organization. You can call us up on the phone. You can talk about issues you're having as you build your programs. Any questions you have on any of the publications, just pick up the phone or send us an email. And, you know, our job is to work with you to help you build the best defenses that you possibly can. It's a dangerous world, but we have to live and operate and work in that world, and we're doing the best we can to make sure that you have all the tools and techniques that you need to do the best job that you can. So again, I want to thank you very much, and if we have time for questions, we'll take those. Thanks again, guys, very much.